Russ Haworth, how are you?
I'm very good, Dom. Thank you. How are you?
I am good. I feel smarter just listening to you already because you've got that cool accent.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, Russ, as you already know, but people listening to the show might not know, I'm a big fan of yours because I listen to your podcast a lot.
Very kind. Thank you.
Yeah. So you run the Family Business Podcast, and I see family business issues here every day. I have for the last 20 years. So I'm really excited to have you here talking to trade contractors about what you've seen over in England. Actually, I'm going to stop. Russ, can you tell us who you are and how you come to be speaking to a group of construction and contracting professionals here in America?
Sure. As you say, I'm a podcast host, but beyond that, I am a family business advisor. So what that means is I work with family-owned businesses or enterprises, and I help them to navigate the complexities that come from that family dynamic. And being in business with your family can be very rewarding, but it can also be really challenging, managing relationships and the blurring of lines between business and family. And so I come in and help them to navigate that and put in place the processes to help move things along more smoothly, shall we say.
Yeah. You know what struck me when I started listening to your show is that here in North America, we're very impressed if a business is handed from one generation to the next. And every once in a while, we see a three-generation business, right? Grandfather to grandson. And I'm going to be sexist here for a moment. Those of you listening, please understand that it could go to either child. But grandfather to grandson to then son, who's running it, and wondering if their son or daughter is going to take it. But I've listened to episodes of yours where it's six-generation families.
Mm-hmm.
And so what struck me, and the reason I asked you to be on the show, is what are you guys doing different? How are we not getting that level of pass it forward? Understanding, of course, we've only been here 100 and some odd years, so we're, But what do you think we're doing, or what are you guys doing? What are you seeing happening there that makes a multi-generational business happen successfully?
Yeah. I think for those that it does work for successfully, we can use those as examples. So we have the royal family, for example, as kind of a pinnacle of what a family business can be. And that
I
passes
would
down.
put Meghan Markle as the pinnacle of a lot of things, yes.
And actually, the example of Harry and Meghan is a very good example because they've now left the family business. And that they've made their way to North America and beyond. And that if you look at the challenges and kind of difficulties that had aligned to it, and they're one of the most wealthy family businesses in the world, and they had difficulty in understanding how to make a move away from the business. It just brings into highlight the challenges that those without the royal family's budget might have. As well. But I think history has a very big part to play in it because there would have been many, many family businesses that didn't make it through to the second, third, fourth and beyond. And there are some statistics that are often used when it comes to family business succession. The most widely used, and they're often used to scare people, and the study was a very specific study. So take all of these with a pinch of salt, but it does highlight the issue. 30% make it from first to second, 13 from second to third, and then 3% beyond that.
Wow.
So it's not something where we have a huge number more than that here in the UK. It's just that because of our history, we have a larger number of businesses that have tried and have succeeded in that sense. So one of the key differences, I guess, with regards to when you're looking at succession for something that is so old is that the business itself becomes a legacy. It becomes something that people feel a custodian of. Whereas when we're talking about first to second generation, often the founder, and it is typically the oldest son or daughter that would then look to take that business on.
Yeah.
There's not necessarily that legacy because it's still a growing and developing business. It's still something where they're in kind of startup mode, or they're establishing and growing as a business and growing as a family. They haven't had the benefit of 400 years worth of trials and tribulations to learn from, and so the dynamic there is completely different. But also, if you imagine a business that is perhaps 400 or 500 years old, the number of descendants that would come from that original family would be huge. So you then have to start looking at how do you decide who can either work or own in this business. Yeah. And so as businesses develop and mature, you can introduce something called governance, which is a very broad term. When I'm talking about family governance, I mean the kind of rules and procedures that govern how the family interacts with the business.
An SOP, standard operating procedure, of course, but yeah, we're going way up a level now into the ownership and legacy level. Wow.
And there are examples where you have to have certain criteria to be able to work in the business, and even stricter criteria to be able to own it. And limiting that ownership means that you don't get the issue of it being dispersed amongst 2,500, 3,000 people, for example, right, which can bring with it its own challenges around communication and the like.
Right. You just happen to have the last name Lannister, to borrow from the Game of Thrones. Just because you're a Lannister doesn't mean you're royalty, right?
Exactly. But it gives everybody the opportunity and sets out the rules to say this: if everybody's playing by the same set of rules as to how they become part of this family business, then there's no favoritism towards one particular lineage within that family.
Yeah. How do you obviously here we're seeing more of that first to second generation handoff. And I'm not sure if you've ever heard this saying, or it's a joke, but it's a tragic one, is that we say from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. Yeah. Have you ever heard that saying?
Yeah, and it is associated with family businesses and family wealth in particular. But in some cases, it can be true. I mean, the saying came about for a reason, but in other cases, it isn't true. So there are businesses that have gone beyond the 3rd generation. I mean, they've had to work at it. They've had to do things.
Well, and that's my question. How do I do that? If I'm the 1st generation and I see that I've got a good business, I've got the fundamentals in place, what do I need to do next to make sure that my family stays intact first? I'm going to impose my own values here. To me, family is first. So I'll say family comes first, but then the business is there to support the family next. What do you think I have to do now to make sure that we get it successfully into the 2nd generation for their success?
Yeah. And where you've just started is a very, very good starting point. So understanding why the business exists is a really good starting point. So does it exist for it to be sold in X number of years' time and utilize the wealth to provide opportunity for the family? Does it exist to provide employment opportunity for family members, be that current or future family members? Right. Does it exist to just act as an ownership vehicle that takes some of the financial pressure off, which means they can go and pursue their own vision and dreams outside of the family business? And that dialogue often needs to happen between generations, because oftentimes what can happen is the business itself can be older than the children that they're potentially passing it on to. And so it was created at a time where the child wasn't sat down and go, I'm thinking of starting this business. What do you think it should be for? Because they might have been either unborn or very young, and they wouldn't, they would Lego. Yeah. They might just say, we want more Lego. So having that discussion with the next generation to say, succession is going to happen at some stage. So either you do it with a warm heart and you pass it on through planning and through structure, and we can get into some of the details of that, or you pass it on with a cold hand and you're subject to whatever laws and rules exist around inheritance and what happens when people pass away, and potentially creating challenges at a time where it's pretty difficult anyway, because you're mourning a loss of a loved one. You don't necessarily want to be talking about, well, who's going to take this thing on now? So having the discussions early has a big advantage, but opening it up and going, okay, what do we want to be doing with this business? Do we want to grow it to create wealth? Do we want to keep it in family ownership? who is family is a big question. So do in-laws, do spouses, do
Adopted
adopted
children.
children? Yeah.
Yeah.
Are they all treated equally within that definition of family? And by having those conversations, you get that stuff out on the table. So it's not a surprise. It doesn't cause any issues later on when inevitably there may be some disagreements on that kind of thing.
There are so many angles that I can see from this conversation. And when I look at the first to second generation handoff and some of the problems that I've seen, I feel like an insignificant speck. I've been coaching for 20 years. Well, who cares? It's nothing. I think the Beretta family is 400 years old, and there's some Japanese family businesses that are hundreds. Thousands, sorry.
Yeah.
Incidentally, what's the most generations you've seen?
So I don't know the business personally, but I think there is one that's 43rd or 45th generation.
Wow.
Still in family ownership. That's Japanese.
Yeah, that's incredible. But let's go back to something that's a little more tangible here. And a situation that I see quite often. And again, this is not meant to be sexist. This is my observation. But a dad started the business, started it in his garage when his kids were young, took all the risks, and he's got, let's say, 3 sons. Not all people are created to be leaders of companies. And not everybody has to be. That's not the end goal for everybody. So I see situations where the firstborn thinks it's a slam dunk that they're going to get the business, but maybe the second or third son is a more appropriate leader. How the heck do I have that conversation without tearing apart my family, knowing that they now have wives and kids and people are looking in from the outside, and how could you do that, etc.? What do we do in that kind of scenario?
It's a scenario that happens very often, unsurprisingly, particularly in that first to second generation transfer, because it's the first time that you're actually having to deal with those conversations. So again, you haven't got, well, last time we did this and that went well and this didn't go so well, so let's work on the bits that didn't go so well. It's the first time you're tackling it. And what can often happen with the firstborn child is just purely through osmosis, there is this expectation on them to take over the business, whether they want to or not. And it could be going around, being on site during the school holidays and just chipping in here and there and helping out with bits and bobs. And it becomes part of who they are as well.
Right.
And that expectation is kind of built into them, whether or not they've really explored whether that's what they want to do or not. The other thing when we're talking about succession is it tends to lump everything in together. So, for example, when you're passing on a business, you can be passing on ownership of that business, you can be passing on management of that business, or you can be passing on leadership of that business.
Right.
And they don't have to be the same person. They don't have to be dealt with in the same way. It could be that the business remains in family ownership, but the right people to drive the business forward in order to achieve the goal of what the business owning family want is an external management team. Right. Or an external manager or an external CEO, whatever terminology you want to put to the person in charge of it. It could be that an external person is best suited for that. It could also be that nobody in that scenario with the 3 brothers, none of them actually want to work in the business, but none of them have got the environment to be able to go
anywhere else.
Oh, this isn't for me.
Yeah.
And it's really difficult. And the introduction of stuff like governance and the processes doesn't necessarily alleviate these issues. It just creates that environment to have those discussions. And the biggest tip I would give on that today is if you can find a way to create an environment where everybody feels safe, but their ideas can be challenged, that's where you want to get to. Because if there is a senior generation going, well, my oldest has got to take this on, they need to be in an environment where that can be challenged, but in a safe way, without people feeling attacked, without it causing this conflict and flaring up of emotions that can come when we're talking about family and business. But dialogue is essential.
Yeah, being able to actually talk is essential. You need a combination of a strong current leader with the flexibility and confidence to listen at the same time.
Correct.
You actually brought up something that I forgot about, and I appreciate you bringing it up. It's the fact that being a shareholder and being an employee of the company are two different things.
Mm-hmm.
And so you don't have to be a shareholder to be an employee, and you don't have to be an employee to be a shareholder. So
Correct.
just because you have the last name, and I'll use my own so that nobody gets offended, except for my kids. Let's say the Rubino family goes on and this turns into a legacy play. Just because my kids have the last name Rubino does not mean they're automatically owners, nor does it mean they're automatically employees.
Correct.
And those things can be separate.
Yeah, and there's a famous model. I say it's famous. It's famous in family business circles. It's not particularly famous outside of that.
Yeah.
But it's a Venn diagram made up of three circles that overlap. And traditionally, in a non-family owned business, you have an ownership system, i.e., the owners of the business have their aims, objectives, priorities, and the way that they function. And then you have a business or management system as well, which is people who work within the business. And sometimes that overlaps. So you have owners that also work within the business. So that brings with it an additional layer of complexity that you wouldn't have if you just owned it or just worked in it. So that's a two-circle model. When you add a family circle onto the top of that, so that it then overlaps, you can have family members who are not owning the business and aren't working in the business who would have influence over that business. Because how many discussions happen at home away from the business with spouses, with children, with other people who might not have anything to do with the business in terms of an ownership or management role, but they're still able to influence those discussions.
I feel like you're speaking directly to me, Russ. Because did I ever tell you about my family business experience?
You mentioned a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, I had, so I was in business with one of my cousins, and we did extremely well. I mean, in 4 years, I built the business to 120 million in revenue.
Wow.
And we were doing very, very well. So well that we knew that if people understood the kind of money that was coming in, they wouldn't, it's outside of the realm of reasonability. And of course, revenues does not equal profit, which is that's another thing only business people would understand. But I can remember very specifically having a conversation with my cousin in the office saying, okay, listen, we're dealing with a lot of money here. We're about to take a dividend. We cannot talk about this outside of this office. And so looking around the table, agreed. I had not even gotten home that night when my mom called me and said, I heard, I won't say my cousin's name, just made this much money. Why didn't you make it? And I thought, first of all, we just agreed. We just had the meeting not to talk about this. And here is my mom talking to my aunt, and my whole family now knew that we had taken a very sizable piece of money out of the business. And I was just beside myself because we had, it's not like this conversation had simmered for a few days and maybe something leaked out. I mean, minutes later.
Right.
It was already coming back to me through my mom. So that is the case where a family person who has no business or management and no ownership stake is an influencer in the business. So I live right there. Yeah. Or I have. Yeah.
And that, if you imagine being in the middle segment of that Venn diagram, so you're an owner of the business, you're a manager of that business, so you have an operational role as well.
Yeah.
And you're a family member, so you own it, run it, and you're a family member. Which hat are you wearing when you're having discussions with your next generation? Are you speaking to them as an owner of a business they may take on one day? Are you wearing a hat that is, look, I'm your mother or father, and therefore this is my viewpoint? And how do you distinguish between those three different hats? And that's really, really difficult. And it's one of the complexities that comes. It's like the fun tax you have to pay in order to have all the benefits of being able to work with your family. Most people find that a positive experience, but a lot of people don't, because there's so much complexity to it. And it's the blurring of the boundaries between those three systems that can often create a lot of the challenges. And sometimes just hearing that for people will be, that explains why we're always arguing about this, is because I'm talking to him in that sense and she's talking to me in that sense, and we're losing our identity as either family members or business owners.
where because people listening to this, especially those in family businesses, are going to be asking, so this sounds great, what do I do? Like, where do I go next? What?
Yeah. Fortunately, there are family business advisors who can provide facilitation effectively. So they provide a structure and a framework to help people to do that. One of the, if it's an advantage of the current global sort of pandemic is more of this is happening online. So you don't necessarily have to find one in your neighborhood in order to work with them. So I deliver this stuff online. If people want to go down that route, then I'm able to do that. But what there's a great saying that is, you can't read the label of the jar you're in. And so having somebody sit there and kind of give you feedback as to what you may or may not be doing, what you may or may not be seeing, where these kind of boundaries need to be created and added to. Having an external third party who is objective, who is not emotionally attached in the same way as you would be to your own businesses, it can be a really useful way of doing it. There is a note of caution on that. Is my work tends to focus on either prevention or cure. So some business owners will have the kind of proactivity or the foresight to go, I think this succession issue is going to cause an issue.
Right.
I understand it's a process, not an event. Therefore, I want help in bringing that process into fruition. That's the minority. The majority of people come to me at a point where it's too painful and they don't know where else to turn.
Yes.
And they go, we need somebody to come in and help sort this out. I've lost the relationship with my father. And again, without being, it is a general statement, but father-son relationships can be very adversely affected within family-owned businesses because you've gained a boss and potentially lost a father in the sense of the relationship between those two people.
Yeah.
And that has a big impact on people. And so the cure side is going in after something has gone wrong and going, okay, right, we need to fix this and let's get things back onto an even keel. But there is a way of being preventative. But either way, it has to be entered into in good spirit, in good faith. It's not, it's too important not to do it properly, if that makes sense.
It does, and I see myself in that role a lot of times because I know I get brought in when difficult conversations have already hit the table or have been skirted for so long that they can't be ignored anymore. And so somebody will make the suggestion to find you, Russ or me, and they'll say, let's bring in a third party here who we can just have a conversation with about the facts that isn't tied up in the family dynamic and who's who and it gets very complicated. Yeah, very quickly. And so it's nice to have a third party who doesn't have a vested interest in the company asking the tough questions like, why are we doing it like this? Is there a better way? Without, and people know when they're asking you or I that question that we don't know what's going on in the background. And so we take them through models. We say, well, here are some choices. Here are some suggested solutions. Here's stories of how other people have dealt with this. What would you guys like to do next? And then, just hold them accountable to making sure that happens.
Absolutely.
In my observation, one of the most interesting things that I've introduced, especially in family businesses, is when I'm doing their coaching, let's just say, for an example, I'm going to meet that family every 2 weeks. And I'm very fond of saying Tuesday at 2:00. It's just a preset time, right? But what I'll suggest to the family is on the other Tuesdays at 2:00, when you're not meeting with me, have your family meeting anyways. And what I found is it's incredible. They've never had this time to have the all Rubino meeting. Yeah, I'll use my family meeting. And all I've said is let's set an all Rubino meeting every Tuesdays at 2, where you guys just talk about everything we spoke about in coaching, but also the things that you guys need to get on the table.
Yes, yeah, and just two things on that. First thing about the external facilitation. One of the advantages of that. It's raising the elephant in the room because it's there. Everyone knows it's there, but nobody's brave enough to bring it up other than the external facilitator who's there to go, well, hang on, what about succession? What plans have you got? Why does this business exist? Because if somebody goes into, again, use that father-son example, son goes to father, why does this business exist? That can feel like an attack.
Yeah.
What do you
Or
mean?
a dumb
Why does it?
question.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so having it done by a facilitator and asking almost a dumb question, why does this business exist? One of the questions I ask is, what does ownership mean to you?
Mm.
Because is it opportunity? Is it financial wealth creation? Is it something
Responsibility.
else? Yeah, philanthropy. Is it community service? What is it that ownership means to you? Because you're opening yourself up to a set of challenges that if you don't understand why you're doing it, it can make it that much harder. And secondly, on your point around family meetings, having structured time where you are able to discuss this away from the normal sort of kitchen table type discussions, or if you're stuck at work late one evening and you're just kind of trying to throw ideas around to get those, they're not the best way necessarily to structure those conversations. So having that time set aside to say, this is what we're going to cover, it's going to be purely business. It can be purely family stuff. We're not allowed to discuss anything to do with the business. We, as a family, are just going to sit around and have a chat about what's going on in our lives that isn't the business. Yeah. It can have such a positive impact.
Yeah, it's amazing when people have the structure. Again, I was joking earlier about SOPs, standard operating procedures, but every meeting should have an agenda and a focus. And meetings are not just to chat; they're for making decisions. And so anybody who's worked with me will laugh, because WWW means who is going to do what by when. And so, Russ, if you and I are having a meeting, there should be at the end of it, who's going to do what by when. And that kind of accountability keeps that meeting moving forward. It keeps it relevant. I have to do my part. If I've committed to you, Russ, that I'm going to get the new contact information for the landlord, it's simple. It's simple, but I have to do it by the next meeting, right? And maybe you're going to get a database of potential new clients in another state, province, shire, county, whatever. All of those things are important, but we can't do it unless it's just a simple step. It keeps the thing moving forward, trundling along. But if we just have visits or conversations over a beer late in the boardroom, that's a different thing than a family meeting where we're actually talking about the company.
Correct. And it's easier to say no to something where there isn't a structure to it. It's easy to go, I'll just miss this one and I'll go on to the next one. And then all of a sudden you miss the next one as well, and then the next one. Whereas if you've got that accountability and you're reporting in and you're making progress towards something, then it becomes far harder to opt out. And if you do keep opting out, those in the family need to hold you accountable for that, to say, well, come on, we're all sat around this table having this discussion. We need everybody to be brought into this.
Yeah.
Structure is good.
It's amazing that maybe the simplest answer to this whole thing about family and succession planning is structure. For whoever's listening right now, that's the leader of the company, thinking about passing it on to the next generation, whatever that's going to look like. I love this Venn. A Venn diagram, by the way, is those circles that overlap that people see, those 3 circles overlapping, right? But if you're the leader of the company now, what I'm taking from you, Russ, is that whether you're talking about ownership, business or management, or the family side, it's time to take that leadership and maybe bring in somebody like a Russ or a Dominic, or there's lots of us out there, to facilitate that conversation, because that becomes safe. You can always point at Russ or Dominic and say, I mean, that's a dumb question those guys just asked, but since it's on the table, let's just humor him and ask. Yeah. And then, why does this business exist? What are we trying to accomplish?
And that's when everyone looks at everyone else to who's going to answer first.
Yeah.
Because, well, that's a dumb question. Nobody wants to be the first person to answer in case they get it wrong. I think one of the other key things to appreciate with particularly with family-owned business is this emotional element. So when we're talking about succession plans, you could go to an accountant or a lawyer or an attorney and say, we need a particular structure in order to help pass this business from one generation to another. And they will produce for you that structure that is entirely logical. It makes perfect sense. And yet there's often resistance around it because they haven't necessarily tackled any of the emotional issues. So if the business is successful and that a business founder set that up many, many years ago, and it's become part of their identity. It is their sense of purpose. It is who they are in that community, is that role within the business. Succession for them may feel like it's being asked to give that role up. So how do they retain that sense of purpose and sense of identity? You imagine going to the golf club or to the country club or wherever, just your mates down the pub, and going, well, how's work? I'm retired now. It's like, oh, that sense of identity starts to move away from the business. And there's lots and lots to be said for preparing the next generation for taking on either an ownership, management, or leadership role. And there's loads of stuff that can be done to help prepare the next gen for that. But also preparing the senior generation for what life's going to be like beyond the family business is important. And you can look at the kind of what are the attributes that you have on your day-to-day work that bring you a sense of well-being, and how can they be replicated away from your role? So could that be mentoring to completely unrelated businesses, going to startups or universities and saying, I want to help mentor and help people with their own business ventures. It could be chairperson, chairman, whatever role it might be. It could be charity work. It could be lots more. But looking at how to prepare the senior generation as much as preparing the next generation is important. And that isn't dealt with in a share transfer or a corporate structure or an accounting mechanism. That loss of identity isn't appreciated within that structure. So talking and communicating about that is a really, really important step as well, because otherwise it becomes bottled up, and at some point there's this frustration that gets let out, and it's not nice when we see it.
Yeah. I wish that I'd had you on as a guest earlier, because I would imagine there are a lot of people listening now who are yelling at the steering wheel or happy. They're like, okay, finally, I can see what I need to do. But you also reminded me of a story that I'd forgotten about. In the city I live in, there is a major land developer and commercial builder. They build towers, and they have land banks where they've bought farmland that looks unusable, but that they're buying it for the next generation and the next generation. These are long-term real estate plays. Now, these guys started as framers, wood stick framers. So they're the guys that would come on site, excavate the house or the apartment building, and then frame it with wood. So that's how they started. And now they're multi-gajillionaire. And of course, the family has multiple versions of themselves all out there. But I remember my landscaper at my house showed up with this guy who was clearly not a laborer, who's really smart but old, and he was swinging a hammer making a retaining wall. And so I said to my landscaper, I'm like, I recognize that guy, and who is he? And so I'm not going to use the family name, but he said, well, that's old man so-and-so. And I'm like, what the hell's he doing here? He goes, he loves being on the tools. He's got more apartment buildings than you could see in the skyline, but he actually loves being on the tools. It's what he loves. And so now that he's retired, he doesn't have to worry. He's got skyscrapers worth of rent coming in. But there he was, swinging a hammer, making my retaining wall. And I just was blown away. But I think that illustrates the point you're making. What do you want to do if you're the owner? What do you really want to do when you could be a chef, you could want to do woodwork. It doesn't matter. Whatever you want to do. Mission work, by the way, is a very big one. For people strong in their faith, they want to give their time back to their religious background and fulfill that. But you hit one right on the head there for me.
Yeah. And another aspect of that, so looking at that from the opposite direction, is if there is a business founder or the leader of the business is particularly impressive, is significant in his presence in the community, however you want to sort of define that, it can be really intimidating for the next generation to be taking that responsibility on. And it can be that, if it's a founder to the second generation perhaps hasn't seen all the mistakes and errors and learning that senior generations had to do. They're just looking at the kind of complete picture as it is now. And so, again, creating that dialogue to make that transition smoother so that people don't feel quite as intimidated by the people who've gone before them.
Yeah.
Because, again, we used the statistic earlier about second to third generation, and third generation thinking, well, the odds are stacked against me because only 3% make it through generation 3. But that doesn't have to be the case. You shouldn't be burdened by that statistic. If you want to make the business work beyond the third generation, it can, and there's ways and means that you can get to it. But often what can happen is that I call it entrepreneurial dilution. And it's where the founder of the business has got a very, very clear vision in their head as to what that business is to look like. And then it'll grow and evolve and develop over time, over decades often. And then the second generation who's grown up in that household will have taken some of that on via osmosis, that startup, that blood, sweat and tears that has gone into creating something that is where it is now. When you move down to the third generation, they've probably grown up in a household away from that founder.
Right.
And so the second generation isn't having to have necessarily the same level of blood, sweat and tears as the founder. And so it's like a dilution of this entrepreneurial spirit.
Right.
That when you get to the third generation, firstly, they're probably 60, 70 years younger than the founder.
Completely different environment, completely different product or service set.
Completely different world that they've grown up in with completely different expectations, access to completely different services and technology and all sorts. I mean, the iPhone's 12 or 13 years old. And it's just incredible how much a role that plays in our life. And you think, well, I still remember phones before where you had to press 1 3 times to get to a C on your text message because
triple tap, yeah.
Exactly. You did have the predictive text or the keyboard, but the impact of that shouldn't be underestimated. But that's also an opportunity to bring in learnings from the younger generation as well as the experience of the senior generation, and create this awesome force that can be used to drive the business forward if that's what people want to do.
Yeah, there's sort of a corollary, like goes along with that, is the saying you should never meet your heroes. Because I'm imagining a third generation business, you've got a picture of grandpa on the wall or grandma on the wall, and you walk past them and all you hear is their hero stories. They overcame this, they did that, they said this thing and completely changed this deal, and everybody knows that. But what we lose, or what we forget, is they're actually just a human. We're only hearing a 1-sentence summary of their entire life. And you think, or we think, that person on the wall was 100% wisdom, never made any mistakes, forged through without any obstacles. And here you are just trying to live in their shadow. Don't do that. Stop. They're probably looking at you now thinking, if they could come back, and we all wish that we could, spend some time with our grandparents, just to have that special time. But they would probably just be so impressed with what you've achieved, what you've accomplished, where you've taken the business. And they, in their quiet moments, would say, I'm so happy to see that you're better at sales than me, or marketing than me, or quality control is so much better, or that you're, stronger in your faith than I ever was. Whatever it is that's important to them that you're doing, that would go on your 1-sentence summary when your picture goes on the wall, right?
Absolutely. And another example of that is if you look at the stock market over 30 years, from a start point to the current point, it's an upward line in a pretty straight line. Whereas if you look at the stock market on a day-to-day basis, it's up and down and all over the place. And it's the same for people's journeys in business, is the day-to-day stuff can be, you can have great days, you can have terrible days. But if you're looking at somebody who's been doing it for 30 years and they've made a success of it, you could be sort of fall into that illusion that it's been this straight line increase year on year of progress. Whereas the reality is when you're living it, is it's up and down and all over the place on a regular basis. Particularly when you throw things like global pandemics into the mix.
Just random. Random. Russ, I have enjoyed this episode beyond anything. I listen to your show all the time because I really like the perspective, and I like your style as well, but I like the perspective that you bring on family business that we don't have in North America. So maybe I'll throw it to you, Russ. If somebody wants to find out more about you and more about how legacy is built in families, how would they contact you?
So if they want to check out the podcast, it is called the Family Business Podcast. So it took ages to come up with
with a good name.
The website for the podcast is fambizpodcast.com. And there's 80 plus episodes on there currently. If people are interested in the type of work that I do, then the website for that is familybusinesspartnership.com. And they can get in touch via social media. I'm on Twitter, LinkedIn, wherever else there is social media.
Yeah.
I'm there, basically.
I always say to people, if they can't reach me, they are not trying.
Yeah.
There's so many social media channels, and I can't check them all in one day.
No.
My Facebook Messenger, LinkedIn messages. I've got things on WhatsApp I haven't even read yet.
Yeah.
Oh, and by the way, there's email, and somebody leaves me voicemails. I could just check those in circle all day long. But anyways, you are easy to find, and I really do enjoy your show because, and I look for outside perspective when I encounter these situations. Quite often, I need to double check what I'm doing when I'm dealing with a family business. So I enjoy listening to your show because I'll hear your perspective or your guests talking about what they've gone through. And it's so interesting to hear that, because now it removes me even from the situations where I'm the third party, listening and guiding and trying to be that we're in a unique position, you and I, Russ, in that we go in, we're like the knights of the round table. I always say King Arthur was the king, but he had knights that he trusted around him for advice. Yeah. And I like to think that we're one of those knights. I'm probably the biggest, baddest knight, the most noble in my head. Yeah. But if you follow that analogy, that's how I see my role, is I'm there to advise the king. So I have to make sure my mind is sharp and making sure that I can do that right.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your comments. Thank you. And I hope if people do want to go and check it out, they can do so. And happy to hear any feedback from those guys as well.
Yeah. Well, those of you listening, thanks for listening. If you do have suggestions to have Russ back on the show, shoot me an email and we'll see if we can entice him to do a show for us again.
I'd be delighted.
Yeah, Russ, thank you so much for your time. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.